All right. Well, thanks very much first to Erica and the European School of Theosophy for inviting me to speak. I appreciate it. I want to begin by just saying something briefly. I wanted to begin just by saying briefly about my own personal trajectory through the society. Because I think if one follows that, you'll understand what it is that I'm about to say, why I've taken this perspective. I found Theosophy in the early 90s, in my early 20s, and I joined the Adia Lodge. There's a picture of the front of the lodge in Cape Town as it used to be. In the lodge, I met an inspirational theosophist, a doctrine student, a great fan of Blavatsky. I joined the sort of obligatory secret doctrine study group, and I was, mesmerized by it all. So much to the point that I thought, well, I'd like to actually study this even more. And I decided to attend the University of Cape Town and study at the Religious Studies Department. So those of you who've studied academically religion will realize I just made a big mistake. The study of religion in the university is not a secret doctrine study group. I was introduced to Max Weber and Karl Marx and Freud, religion as belonging, religion in sacred space, all manner of things that I really wasn't anticipating. But once you're exposed to it, you can't really just ignore it. That's been my experience. And I can say for the last 30 odd years, it's been a struggle in my mind to reconcile academic study of religion with theosophical commitments. And this presentation of mine reflects my journey, I think, and to the point where I've arrived. I have two lectures. In the first, I'll discuss theosophy as an interpretive enterprise. I'll pick an example, how theosophy engages with the constitution of the individual. And I will try to show that a fundamental problem is posed with the theosophical perspective. In part two, I'm going to try to show how we can engage that problem and end up with a different reason for studying ancient Egypt. And the reason I hope to propose is that study as a preparation and a mirror of the initiations. So that's the journey which I hope to take you on. So that's a picture of Eric Horning's book. Eric Horning is an actual Egyptologist. And in the beginning of it, I think it's well known by now, he makes a distinction between Egyptology and Egyptosophy. Egyptology is a professional discipline with language specialists, which began more or less in 1822 with when hieroglyphics could be deciphered. And for him, Egyptosophy is, and I quote, the study of imaginary Egypt viewed as the profound source of all esoteric law. This Egypt is a timeless idea bearing only a loose relationship to the historical reality. So this is the beginning of the challenge already. Professional Egyptologists have made a distinction between what we are saying and what their research shows. He goes on to say and oversteps his bounds by saying the esoteric is a way of thinking unto itself, irrational and intuitive. It lives on the magic of the mysterious. So we don't have to agree with him on that, but he does point to a fundamental issue, and I hope to show why I think that is the case. To respond to what I think is the challenge of Egyptology, my proposal will be that we have to start asking different questions about what theosophy is doing in its study of Egypt. Things like, why do theosophists study ancient Egypt? Why don't we just state our position? Why do we engage with ancient Egyptian texts? We're not, as far as I know, language specialists, archaeologists. Why do we study ancient Egypt? How do we study ancient Egypt? I hope to touch a bit on that. And then finally, what is being done through the theosophical study of Egypt? So not so much what are we saying about Egypt, but what are we doing when we study ancient Egypt? I set myself a few aims with these two presentations. The first would be to confront and respond to the implicit and explicit academic criticism of the theosophical interpretive enterprise. I hope to provide a rationale for the theosophical study of ancient Egypt. I want to try and use a more contemporary vocabulary to provide a partial foundation for the theosophical effort. There's a great deal of philosophical and literary criticism research in the last century and this century, which I don't often see used by theosophists, and I think there's opportunity for us there. Important to me because it is such a foundation of my entering into the Theosophical Society is to rehabilitate the place of study in the Theosophical Society, and in particular of Blavatsky's secret doctrine. And as I mentioned, the outcome I hope to come is that I will reread the theosophical engagement with ancient Egypt as a mirror of and preparation for the mystery initiation process. So I want to begin with this duck-rabbit illusion. I've always liked this illusion. Is the duck and the rabbit both there? Did the author intend it? Which one did you see first? And I'm sort of suggesting here an analogy with the Egyptosophy, Egyptology distinction. There's lots of ambiguity or illusion, shall we say, in our engagement with the text. And here's a textual ambiguity. This is from Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, but a quote from the Book of the Dead. HUB writes, or quotes, "I am the creative soul of the celestial abyss. None sees my nest. None can break my egg. I am the Lord." This occurs in the mundane egg chapter of the Secret Doctrine. And when theosophists think of certain words like egg, we might think of the Hiranya Garbha. When you think of soul, certain concepts come to mind. But, you know, what does this statement mean? How do we understand this statement? And there's lots of examples I could draw on, but here is another example of this tension or ambiguity. HUB in the doctrine mentions an image on a temple of Philo, I think she calls it, where two initiates or adepts are initiating a candidate. On the left, or my left, is a picture from the collected works. On the right, I have a clearer picture of the same image. So for HUB, she comments specifically on this image and says this is an image of an initiate with two adepts initiating a candidate. For Egyptologists, this is a coronation or a baptism ritual of the pharaoh. So that again is just this distinction between Egyptology and Egyptosophy. When we look at these images, can we just see what they are saying, or are we bringing something to these pictures? So that's the question I want to pose based on this distinction between Egyptology and Egyptosophy. I want to now just move briefly to some of the interpretive techniques that I think Theosophy brings to religious texts in its study. On the right is, of course, the famous diagram from the Secret Doctrine. This is the basic template for me of Theosophy. And everything, religions are plotted on this template, the 3 higher planes, the 7 lower. This is a structural interpretive diagram. But, you know, fundamental to Blavatsky's interpretive thing is a spiritual and material binary, which translates into an esoteric and an esoteric reading of a text. Now, this is a strategy to say that there's an esoteric meaning to a text, means that you can interpret this text in a way that is not obvious. And it's obviously, it seems like there's a certain politics of interpretation. Once you say something is hidden in a text, you have to ask, well, who is allowed to uncover this mystery? What guides this uncovering process? So the structural emplotment, that would be the diagram. Functional equivalencies. Theosophy draws, will string certain deities together, for instance, creative deities across religious traditions, and say, well, they perform the same function, and therefore they are representing the same cosmic process. A selection and a rejection. We think of that quote of HPB where she says, scattered throughout even the Book of the Dead are our esoteric truths. So if something is scattered about, how do we identify which belongs to us and which is exoteric? What guides the selecting hand? And she invokes any number of other interpretive things, and I just mentioned them here. Analogy, allegory, symbolism, blinds, the number or color symbolism, magic and myth as science, philological speculation, 7 keys. The 7 keys have always intrigued me because I'm not aware of any actual theosophical study where we have applied the 7 keys to a text. So if we don't apply these keys to a text, but we think these texts encode these 7 levels of meaning, who else is going to do it? And this is how we engage all texts, not just Egyptian texts. Olav Hammer, academic, in his book, what is it? Goes blank now. In his book, came up with a great term, pattern recognition. So Theosophy is looking for patterns. And this is a diagram from the Secret Doctrine where we can see tables are drawn and equivalencies are presented. Olav Hammer's book was Claiming Knowledge by Brill. So what I want to show here is that through these equivalencies, Theosophy is generating or creating meaning. When we say, if I take one example, the bar in the Egyptian concept of the human being is equivalent to our astral body. Our astral body teachings can now flood into Egyptian texts. Here is another correspondence. If we say Osiris is equivalent to Atman, when we read Osiris in an Egyptian text, our teachings on the Atman can be injected into Egyptian texts. And this is how we create meaning. I have quite a few other diagrams in my actual paper. This type of engagement has 2 problems for me. The first is there are multiple diagrams of these correspondences to do with the human being, but there's no consistency in them. We don't know what the esoteric correspondences are. In addition to that, there's a certain assumption that there's just 7 principles. So I took from, let me just go to the next one. Yeah. So I took from Budge, like a list of aspects of the human being that he mentions. And there it is: cut for the body, ka for the double, ba for the heart soul, ab for the heart. Another scholar has 2 different words for the heart: kaibet for shadow, ku for spiritual soul, Sekhem for power, Ren name, Sahu spiritual body. All in all, I count 10, but Theosophy works on a number symbolism of 7. And this 7 isn't just arbitrary. It's related to our rounds and root races, to our planetary chain. It's integrally linked into our whole perspective. And when I read some of the early Theosophical literature, we could see already that this was a problem. It was noticed that the correspondences between the principles, Egyptian and Theosophical, weren't consistent. And one response was, well, it was just pointing to the fact that there are supposed to be 7. The actual identity, was secondary. But I don't think that is, well, it's not good enough for me, I guess. It's not convincing. If we think that these are in the text, we need to be able to show it, because that is our wisdom tradition. And we need the 7. They must correspond to the 7 principles, the 7 rounds, and the 7 root races, because that is our teaching on the cosmic unfolding of humanity. That's the first problem. How many principles? What are the correspondences? And the second, more profound problem, perhaps to me, is that our Theosophical perspective assumes that ancient Egypt and all traditions thought in precisely the same way. They had a notion of a separable body, soul, and spirit. But to my great shock, when I read academic studies of ancient Egypt, this is precisely what they deny. Now, if they deny that, this is a challenge to our Theosophical teachings, our rounds and root races, the unfolding of our principles, which is not clear to me how we can actually counter. So I just want to focus a little bit on this second problem, which is, how did the ancient Egyptians conceptualize the human being? Here's this famous image, representation of the human-headed Barsal hovering over the mummy. So much like that duck rabbit image, when we look at it, what do we see? What do Egyptologists see? Why don't we see the same thing? Are we bringing things to the text? What is actually going on? So related to that, I have 3 quotes here. The first is from a Theosophical article, more or less the best article to my mind that I found by Theosophists, 1941. So they quote a phrase here. So this is a quote of an Egyptian text. The first sentence: "Thine essence in heaven, thy cut is in the earth." And Wellens and Oderberg comment, it is simply, they're talking of the cut, the body. It is simply the fleshly vehicle of all the principles, our stula sharira. So for them, the cut is just the body, matches our physical body. But this phrase, thine essence in heaven, thy cut to earth, it's quite a common phrase in Egyptian text. And I have 2 more that I've taken from Louis Zabkar, which an academic whose works I have taken as representative of Egyptology. He writes, "May thy Ba live in heaven near Ra. May thy Ka be divine among the gods. May thy corpse endure in the underworld near Osiris. May thy mummy be efficient among the living Aks." And in another one he writes, "May thy Ba live in heaven near Ra. May thy Ka be provisioned among the gods. May thy mummy be efficient among the Aks. May thy name be enduring on earth near Geb. May thy corpse endure in the necropolis." So it's not always completely apparent, but for us, through that system of correspondences, when we read Ba or when we read Ka, and we correspond them to certain theosophical principles, we then must now think that those entities will take on characteristics of our theosophical teachings. That is the purpose of drawing those lists of correspondences. but the texts don't seem to support our statements. So we can fall back on an exoteric distinction, but it makes the exoteric so distinct, completely unrelated, that it's very hard to support. Well, this is, I'd have put this slide a bit earlier, but these are just academic resources I'm drawing on. But let me just move to here. So when academics study Egypt, they will bring a vocabulary. It'll be words like I mentioned here: God, soul, salvation, heaven, essence. But they don't have set meanings. These meanings will be adapted to the text at hand. So when a text is translated, an Egyptian text, for example, is translated and the word soul is used, it will take on an identity of what it means, of what they understand it to mean within that religion, within the Egyptian context. Now, when a theosophist uses the word soul, we really have our middle principle in mind. So when I read, I am the creative soul of the celestial abyss, the word soul is laden with theosophical meaning. Our meanings don't change. We insert them into text. Of course, we say that it is there esoterically, we read it out, and that's fine. But academics are doing something different. They're trying not to make texts conform to preset ideas. So they have a standard vocabulary so that comparison is possible, but it is used within the context of text. When Theosophy interprets a text, we change the context of the text. Our words retain their meanings. When I read the word heaven in an Egyptian text, I might think of the Deva chant. That would be an equivalent. Now, the Deva chant means something theosophically, and we will see that meaning now in a word like heaven in a translation. So two different things are happening when we look at a text and when Egyptologists look at an Egyptian text. And just, to try and build on this notion of how we conceive of the human being. Because our language is set, we conceive of a human being in a certain way across all texts. Now, for the very first time in my life, reading academic Egyptologist texts, I found an anthropology completely at odds with the theosophical position. For them, the human being is not separate into body, soul, and spirit. Some portion doesn't die with the body, and the soul goes to heaven. The ba, the ka, the ak, all those elements that we mentioned are conceived of as a spiritual and material unit. And a person can transform into various spiritual material units. So the complete person can be conceived of as the ka, or the complete physical and spiritual person can be conceived of as the ba, or the ak. They're not separable parts. One doesn't fall away. If we, for example, think that the ka corresponds to the prana, just think what our after-death teachings are with the prana. It dissipates, but that's not what Egyptian texts say happened to the ka. The sense of when the word soul is used in an Egyptian text, as translated, of course, it references the individual's capacity to transcend their given form of life and given state of existence, but as a full physical and material entity, it is not the spiritual component of a once living human being. I'm going to just read, because I think it's so important for For those people who've exposed themselves to academic study, to grapple with these things, I want you to just read a few passages from Zabkar's book. So this is Zabkar from his book, The Study of the Bar in Ancient Egypt. So we were talking about that image of the bar separating from the mummy and those quotes even that Theosophical used, and he writes, "It is understandable that many historians of Egyptian religion, confronted with the apparent dualism of the bar to heaven, corpse to the duat, have tried to identify the bar as the spiritual element in opposition to the body as the material or physical element. The Egyptian concept of man knew no such distinction. First of all, as we have seen, there is nothing in the pyramid texts which would indicate the bar is a spiritual element. Secondly, the coffin texts confirm our thesis because they speak of the bar performing certain functions typical of physical and not of spiritual agents. Furthermore, through rites and ceremonies, even the so-called material element, that is the body, or better, the corpse, can be spiritualized, that is divinized, in which state it is sometimes referred to as Sa. Thus, in no case can we say that the Egyptian conceived of man as dichotomous, nor even trichotomous or tetrachotomous, the Ba, Ka, Ak corpse. In any such case, some important entities will still be left out, such as the shadow, the heart, and the Sa. He'll go on, the bar is not a part nor an element of man, but one of the forms in which he fully lives after death. The bar is the man himself, his personified alter ego. So it's a completely different conception of the after-death states and of what happens after death to what Theosophists say. To me, it is a fundamental challenge to our teachings if Egyptians thought like this. Just to, I guess, conclude, my first presentation, I just want to consolidate the challenge. How many principles? We need 7, because they're linked to our 7 rounds and root races and the unfolding of our principles. Are there even principles at all? Do Egyptians even think of in terms of separate elements which have different post-mortem, movements? And then, if we accept that there is this distinction, is Theosophy rising to this challenge? Can it rise to this challenge? And perhaps just to ask the last question, should it rise to this challenge? And I guess I feel as if we do have to. Thank you.